Christian worship, genuine Christian worship, will always be seen as an abomination to whoever's in control and whoever's in power. I do want to take a moment and just quickly take an excursus on Goshen and Egyptian records. And an excursus just means like a side trip. Because about this time every year, we're coming up on Passover, we're coming up on Egypt, on Easter and such. The History Channel or some Discovery Network channel has some trash documentary about how the Exodus never happened. And generally, what they're really after is their kind of moral libertinism, because they want, if there's no Exodus, then there's no God, and if there's no God, then we get to do whatever we want to do. So that's why they say there's no Exodus. And they'll typically criticize the Exodus on 2 points. And it's important because Goshen is one of those points. They'll point right here, okay? Because there are not many, if any, Egyptian records that identify a place that the Egyptians would know as Goshen. So that's point number one. They'll typically say, if you look at the hieroglyphs, there's not a single mention of the land of Goshen anywhere. So clearly, this didn't happen, right? And they would say it's not in the same place that you and I know of a place called Tennessee. They would say the Egyptians did not know of a place called Goshen. Okay, point number one, perhaps. But other detractors will point to a void of written Egyptian records on this mass of people leaving and these signs and wonders. I'm going to discuss that aspect of things. We get to chapters 12. We get a little further once we actually cross the Red Sea. But let's talk about Goshen for a second. On Goshen for a second. Egyptian sources, even though they don't name a place called Goshen, they make frequent references to Semites entering into a land, into the eastern delta, which is where the Nile River fans out into the Mediterranean Sea. That's the delta. In the eastern delta, Egyptian records do talk about Semites, which would be people from the land of Israel, settling in the eastern delta for flocks. The Egyptians they didn't tend herds. They weren't a nomadic people like the Israelites were. So the fact that there are people tending flocks is distinct, and the Semites being there is distinct. The second point is that archaeology confirms the presence of Semites in the Eastern Delta during the second intermediate period into the New Kingdom. So we know both from their records, they technically never had the name Goshen, but there are Hebrews living there, and we can dig a shovel in the ground and find Hebrew pottery. So they might not have called it, the Egyptians might not have called it Goshen, but there are Hebrews living there. And then third, the New Kingdom Egyptian literature, it talks about the virility, so the livelihood, the greenness of Goshen, placing the Israelite complaints about the wilderness in their appropriate context. If you've ever wondered, why would the people want the meat pots and cucumbers? Because cucumbers don't typically grow in deserts like Egypt in the upper region of the Nile. It's because they live in the delta where it's really green. Everything grows there. And they're walking through the Sinai Peninsula. And they're like, man, we had it really good in the delta, right? There's one other clue that's really interesting. It's from Genesis 46. When Joseph tells his brothers to come in, do you remember how he tells them to identify themselves to Pharaoh? You probably don't. That's okay, because I didn't until I looked it up. He says, identify yourself as shepherds so that he would put you in Goshen, because Joseph knew the lay of the land and knew the best places for them to graze their sheep. So he has them land in Goshen. And the reason he says it is because the shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Genesis 46. Shepherds at worship in their sense are worse than the nomadic, right? Because shepherds smell. And if you're a sophisticated urbanite, a shepherd is just kind of gross to you. And of course, Joseph's statement about shepherds is something that it contextualizes even Moses' fear, if it is fear, in fact, it might just be really clever rhetoric by Moses, that the Egyptians will be offended by the Israelites' worship, you see, because they're from the delta, they're shepherds, they're nomadic people, they live over there. I suspect, and I posit to you, that perhaps one of the reasons that Goshen doesn't exist on Egyptian records is the same reason perhaps that we know when we say what the Rocket City is, we know what it is, and we know we're in it and where it is, even though it's not on maps, official maps, written records from the U.S. government. You say, where's Rocket City? If you look at, well, there's no place as Rocket City. But we say, well, we know it's Rocket City. And the other part is that there is at least one written record that has the name of Goshen, and those are the geological facts. So those are trash documentaries. And the other about the writing with the Exodus, I'll just say, well, a bit of a teaser for later. The Egyptians were really superstitious. If you would write down something, they believed it would happen again. So one of the other reasons, any time that there were losses, for instance, in their military campaigns, they didn't really write those down in their records too, for fear that it would happen again. So if a bunch of shepherds show you up and walk out of your land, you're probably not going to write that down. But that little detail sheds light on why the Egyptians perhaps found them an abomination. But here's the important observation for us today. At 8:26, they'll find us as an abomination, kind of coming out of that excursus back into the practical. The countercultural nature of biblical worship will always seen as an abomination to the dominant religions of the day and age. Like Christian worship, genuine Christian worship will always be seen as an abomination to whoever's in control and whoever's in power. So we, like the Israelites here, are always going to be seen as an abomination.